One of the best ways to think about moral virtue is to ask the question, what qualities or what characteristics are necessary for a person to have to do what is right? So far in our study, we've discussed 3 of the so-called cardinal or classical virtues, and we've talked about how you need each of them if you're going to do what is right in life. In order for your will to be directed toward the right thing, in order for you to do what is right by God and by other people, then you need the virtue of justice. But justice by itself isn't enough, because you might want to do what is right. You might have the best of intentions, but if you don't understand a situation, or if you don't know how to think through what's actually needed or anticipate the consequences of your actions, then you may end up doing more harm than good, or just not getting anything done at all. We Southerners have a saying, bless his heart, which is really just a polite way of saying, that guy's heart's in the right place, but he has no clue what he's doing. And that's why, in addition to justice, you need the virtue of prudence. But justice and prudence alone are still not enough, because you might want to do the right thing. You might even be thoughtful and wise, prudent in thinking through your actions. But if you don't have the virtue of temperance, then, as we discussed in the last session, then you might end up getting misled by your own appetites and bad habits and not end up doing what you know you should. In other words, justice and prudence help direct you toward doing the right thing, and temperance helps protect you from being controlled by your belly rather than your mind. But there is one other very important virtue. Because if you're gonna do what is right, then there is one more obstacle you'll have to overcome. And that obstacle is fear. Have you ever noticed how many times in the Bible that it is fear that prevents people from doing the right thing? In Numbers chapter 14, the people of Israel, they're all standing at the edge of the promised land. For over 400 years, since the time that God spoke to their forefather Abraham, this people have been preparing themselves to inhabit this land. It's everything they've been waiting for. But when the moment comes, they draw back. They refuse to follow God's command and go into the land. And why? Because they are afraid. They're afraid of the strength of their enemies. Fear is also what caused King Saul to lose his throne, because it was fear that made him wrongly offer a sacrifice when the prophet Samuel was delayed, fear of the people. It was fear that caused him to do things like consult that witch and try to have the young David assassinated. In the parable, you might remember in the parable that Jesus tells about the 3 servants who were each entrusted with money from their master. It is fear that causes the third one to fail to make any attempted investment. It was fear that caused Jesus' disciples to abandon him at his trial, and it was fear that made Peter deny him 3 times. You can have the best of intentions. You can make the wisest plans, but if your fear of suffering, or your fear of death, or your fear of loss or hardship overcomes you, then you too will fail to do what is right. And that is why we need the 4th cardinal virtue, the virtue of courage. To quote Thomas Aquinas, now the human will is hindered in 2 ways from following the rectitude of reason. First, by being drawn by some object of pleasure to something other than what the rectitude of reason requires. And this obstacle is removed by the virtue of temperance. Secondly, through the will being disinclined to follow that which is in accordance with reason, on account of some difficulty that presents itself. In order to remove this obstacle, fortitude of the mind is required. Like I said, you need good reason, which is prudence. You need rectitude of will, which is justice. Then you need 2 more virtues to deal with obstacles, temperance and courage, or as Thomas calls it, fortitude of mind. In order to understand courage, the first thing we need to do is to clarify some common misunderstandings. The Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft has identified some of these common misunderstandings. For example, he says that sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that being courageous is the same thing as being bold or daring, and that courage somehow consists in being willing to take risks or dares or do something that other people think is foolhardy. But that isn't true. Courage isn't just a matter of having the guts to do something that's daring or dangerous. There are entire television shows dedicated to people daring each other to do dangerous or ridiculous things and then seeing whether they're brave enough and dumb enough to do it. That is not what Christians mean when they talk about courage. Because courage, true courage, is the willingness to endure harm or danger specifically for the purpose of accomplishing some good. If Jesus, for instance, if Jesus had provoked the civil authorities and tried to get them to arrest or crucify him just to prove that he had the temerity to go through with it, he wouldn't have shown courage. What made Jesus' resilience in the face of death so courageous is precisely that he was doing it for our redemption. Again, to quote Thomas Aquinas, in overcoming danger, fortitude seeks not danger itself, but the realization of the good. That's one common misunderstanding. Another misunderstanding, according to Peter Kreeft, is that we often think of courage as something that really only applies to those who are facing the threat of violence or death, or those who are called to do some kind of heroic act. We often think, as Kreeft says, that courage is a specialty for soldiers rather than a necessary aspect of every virtue. Or maybe as Christians, we associate courage with Christians who are facing extreme persecution, or with martyrs or missionaries who serve in politically hostile environments, rather than thinking of courage as a kind of everyday virtue that we all need, regardless of our situation. That's a misunderstanding, and I think that one of the ways we can correct that misunderstanding and better understand the role courage plays in our lives is to recognize that death and violence are not the only things we fear. We also fear that we won't have enough money in the future to pay for college tuition or for retirement or for some kind of unexpected medical cost. Sometimes we fear that if we say or do something, that it may offend someone or that people might think less of us or that we might be shunned in some way. The truth is there are many different kinds of suffering that we fear. And there are a lot of different goods that we worry about them being taken away from us. And because we're afraid, we hesitate and we don't say what we know we should, or we don't do what we know we should do. And that's why we need courage, not just in those moments that require some kind of heroic act, but in our everyday lives. It takes courage to speak a hard truth to a friend or loved one. It takes courage to do what is right when you know you might suffer consequence. For that matter, it takes courage to give our tithes and offerings to God every week in worship. And usually when we don't tithe or when we're not very generous in our giving to those in need, usually it's because we're afraid that we won't somehow have enough in the future. So you see, courage isn't just for heroes. Courage is an everyday Christian virtue. And courage is cultivated by normal, everyday commitments to do the right thing, even when it makes us nervous or afraid. As Stanley Hauerwas puts it, courage is required for the ability to negotiate the more mundane aspects of our lives. And it is from the daily habits of courage that we are formed, eventually, into courageous people. So that's what courage is, and that's why it's important. But how, you might ask, how do I become courageous? Stanley Hauerwas gave one answer to that question in the quote I just cited. You become courageous, he says, through daily habits, through small acts of courage. By making it a habit of doing the right thing, even when you're anxious or nervous. That's how you become more courageous. But I think that we can say more than this. As I mentioned earlier, the Bible speaks very frequently about fear and about people drawing back from doing the right thing because they're afraid. So, we might ask, how in the Bible do people deal with such fear? Other than telling us to be courageous, how does God actually enable us to be courageous? I would suggest that the primary way that God enables us to be courageous is by refocusing our attention, by turning our attention away from whatever it is that's causing us to fear, and turning our attention instead onto God Himself and His promises. Let me give you a couple examples of what I mean. You may remember that when God first appeared to Moses at the burning bush, and He told him to go lead His people out of Egypt, you may remember that Moses' first response was to try to get out of it, because he was nervous and afraid. He was afraid that the Israelites wouldn't listen to him. He worried about the fact that he wasn't a powerful or eloquent speaker. And ultimately, as he's kind of having this back and forth with God, he begged God to find a different representative. Oh, my Lord, please send someone else. But God refused to send someone else. He insisted that Moses be courageous and do what he was being told to do. But, and this is important, God didn't simply tell Moses that he needed to be courageous. God gave him a reason for courage. Because every time Moses objected, God gave him some kind of promise. I will be with you. I will be with you. I will give you the words to say. I will make sure that the people believe what you tell them. You have no reason to fear. Just remember me. Now, fast forward several hundred years to the reign of Israel's first king, King Saul. You remember what happened when Saul and the men of Israel, when they were gathered together that day for battle against the Philistines? The Philistines had that giant warrior named Goliath, who was taunting the Israelites and mocking them, saying that he would personally fight any champion that they chose. But none of them would volunteer. No one would fight because they were all terrified. As we read in 1 Samuel chapter 17, all the men of Israel, when they saw Goliath, fled from him and were much afraid. But there was one young man, a young shepherd named David, who refused to back down, a mere youth who demonstrated more courage than all the hardened warriors of Israel. But what was it that gave David that courage? What was it that enabled him to step onto the field and face Goliath in combat? Was it that he'd trained himself somehow to be a man of courage? No, again, what we find is that David gained courage by focusing not on the danger in front of him, not thinking primarily about Goliath, but thinking about the character and the promises of God. When King Saul asked David, "How are you going to do this?" David's response was, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." It wasn't just a matter of David having guts. It was that David had faith in God. And isn't that precisely what we see throughout all of Scripture, that what enables God's people to respond with courage is never simply their own personal grit or strength of mind, but their confidence in God and His deliverance? Isn't that what enabled Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to face a fiery furnace? And for their friend Daniel, to sit unbothered in a lion's den? What enabled Peter and John to continue preaching in the book of Acts when they were being threatened with punishment? What gave the Apostle Paul the ability to encourage a frightened ship's crew and passengers when their ship was wrecked at sea? And isn't that what gave courage to the heart of Stephen, the first martyr, when the crowd rose up against him and began to throw rocks at him? What gave Stephen courage in that moment is that he didn't focus his attention on the threats of the crowd, but instead he turned his eyes toward God. And Stephen said, "Behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." Moses, David, Daniel, Peter, John, Paul, Stephen, all men who displayed extraordinary courage. And all men who received courage by focusing not on their own strength and not on the dangers they were facing, but on the God who had promised to be with them, on the Lord who had proved time and again that he was their deliverer. What does Psalm 56 say? "When I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" Do you want to be a courageous person? Do you want to have the fortitude to do what is right, even when you fear the consequences? Do you want to have the courage to say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done? Then do what the psalmist did. When you are afraid, turn your attention toward God and say to yourself, "In God I trust. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" Do that, and you will discover the courage to act.